Hello, everybody. So, before I jump right into this, I just want to say keep the comments civil. If I see anyone name calling, the comment gets deleted. And second of all, I am not a professional on this issue at all. I am not someone who studies autopsies and stuff like that. So, just bear that in mind as we go through this. I'm doing the best I can, but I'm going to have flaws. Please leave comments correcting me on everything because I know I'm going to mess stuff up, and then I'm going to update the spreadsheet later on. But basically, I've been waiting a while for this autopsy. Jeffrey Epstein, you guys probably all know about him. But recently, there was someone who sat in on the autopsy itself, Michael Baden, and he revealed some details about this autopsy that people are seeing as suspicious. Maybe this reveals that it's a suicide. And the thing about this is that I'd like to take a scientific look. And so I decided to do just that. And I spent way too much effort on this not to share it with everyone else. Now there's if you, before you form an opinion on this, definitely watch till the end of the video because there's a lot of little details in there that I'm gonna give you guys that you guys really need to know, before forming an opinion on this. But anyways, basically what I did is I figured, well, there's all these different symptoms. For instance, there were a few fractures. What is the chance that is going to occur in a hanging incident versus a strangulation incident? Because those are basically the two leading theories right now. And then we can compare the two to sort of figure out, well, what's the chance that one or the other. Now, there's a lot of flaws in this. One of the big things is that obviously we are only going by the information given to us so far. There might be a lot of other details that do favor the chance of hanging, and I just don't know about those right now. But we'll go over flaws in a little bit. So basically, there were a few different things that there was. There was a hypoid fracture, and the chance of that, basically, the chance of that happening in hanging is 27%, 50% in strangulation, and you go through all these different symptoms. Now, I'm going to go through the symptoms one at a time here, just gives a little bit of insight for this. Now, there was a fracture in his the thyroid cartilage around the Adam's apple, and basically I couldn't really find specific information on that because a lot of this stuff is actually really, really rare. So I just looked at laryngeal fracture, which is basically that area, and I looked at the statistics for that, and it's about the same actually between strangulation and hanging chance, contrary to what is said in most articles. Because most articles will either say it's much more common in strangulation or it's much more common in hanging, and so this kind of is interesting in that regard. Now, the other thing was an eye hemorrhage. Now, the eye hemorrhage is interesting because in hanging that happens at about 55.8% and 85% in strangulations. Now, the source on this I'm not quite sure of because I went in there's like a law professor's site, so this is basically a professional giving testimony about this, and I believe the way it worked is they actually made their own study on this, and they were testifying about that study. So I didn't actually link the study itself, which I probably should. But basically, that's what's going on there. Just want to leave that caveat there. And there's also throat tissue hemorrhage, which is, again, is pretty common in both cases. I wasn't sure about the scientific name for this, so once again, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. I'm not a professional on this in any regard. But the reason I'm posting this is I think it is important to take a scientific look at this because there's a lot of articles out there detailing the chances of, well, if you get strangled, what's the chances it's going to happen to you versus hanging. So if we take a look at that, we can kind of get an estimate as to, well, what really happened, what are the chances. And so I'm not a really big conspiracy theorist, so I'm not, throwing anything out there. But for those of you that are interested in information on this, here is just, an extra little scientific look at this. So if we look at our overall chances, the chances of all these symptoms in someone that was hung is about 4% or about 12% for strangulation. The relative chance then is there is about a 75% chance that Jeff was strangled and a 25% chance that he was hung, according to these calculations, which is quite interesting. Now, you might all of a sudden be thinking, oh, yes, so he definitely was strangled. Well, there's still a 25% chance that he wasn't, according to these calculations. And these calculations have some flaws, which we'll go over right now. So basically, and by the way, this is a pretty good estimate. I spent several hours trying to get all this information together, and I'm sure that some people will correct me in the comments. I'll get a more accurate estimation. This document will be linked in the description. and it will be modified as people send me more accurate information and all this stuff. Basically, link a study, I'll take a look at it, use the more accurate studies. All right, so what are the issues with this method that I went about trying to estimate the chances that he was strangled versus hung? Well, the first issue is that there's age. So basically, and a lot of the articles are stating is that, well, the chance of getting these bone fractures varies depending on age. Now, you might not think, well, I'm looking at the relative fracture rate, so it doesn't matter, right? Wrong, because these studies are looking at particular age groups. So, for instance, if this study here looks at people, there's a lot older people that get strangled versus a lot younger people that commit suicide by hanging, that's going to skew the statistics. And as a result, the hang chance is actually a lot lower, or the strangle chance is actually a lot higher in this particular case, because Jeff was around 66, I believe, when he died. So the other thing is the study methods themselves. So studies often use very different methods. Typically when I look at a study, I like to nitpick all the little ways they go about doing their things. And I didn't really do that this time around, simply because I don't have a ton of time today. I've actually got a big exam coming up. And once again, I'm not professional. So, I did the best I could, but study methods are very important. Most of these are looking at 200 different autopsies and trying to figure that out, or looking at MRIs and whatnot to figure out what was actually damaged. All right, next thing is study discrepancy of description. So basically, once again here, I try to unify some of the descriptions here, but some of the descriptions I wasn't sure about. Hypoid fracture, for instance, I looked that up. I guess I have one article, it's actually a Wikipedia page, so you look at the study in that, it actually points to both areas. So the study methods are going to be the same, which is nice. But most of these, I don't have a universal sort of description and method about obtaining these data. So the other issue is obviously that I'm not sure about all the sources. Like I was mentioning earlier, I'm really not sure about this, professor. I haven't looked at the actual study itself. I'm just looking at the testimony of a guy who apparently wrote a study. So that's important to remember. And hey, there's some journals that are a lot more reliable than others. So that's important to remember too. In addition, I'm not accounting for margin of error in any of this, so it could actually be that it's 50 to 25% relative chance and 50 to 100% relative chance. Basically what that means is that a lot of these studies, their sample sizes aren't significant. I think for most of these, I did get situations where it's 100 plus individuals, so the sample size is actually pretty significant. But for instance, if you're talking about a pretty rare condition, you're going to need a massive sample size with thousands and thousands of individuals to actually get reliable data for this sort of thing. So that's just important to note. I'm not accounting for margin of error. Once again, it's really complicated. Please forgive me. I'm trying the best I can. And the other thing is interlocking factors. So for instance, let's say you get a thyroid fracture. Maybe that increases your chance of getting a throat tissue hemorrhage. And in that case, those factors would be linked, and therefore their relative chances wouldn't be as important or as viable. So that's important to remember as well. Just some things to consider right there. All right, and also I found a few conflicting research articles. For instance, I found one study that said, in my research, that said there was actually a 17% chance of any fracture at all when getting hanged, which obviously contradicts this, that contradicts this, so bear that in mind. I tried to go with the most reliable source as well as the sources I found first, but obviously in this particular case, this would benefit the chance that Jeffrey was strangled rather than hung, so just bear that in mind for that particular study. But there's a lot more out there. Once again, this is why I want, if there's a professional looking at this right now, tell me where I'm wrong so I can do this right. And last but not least, we have gender differences, because I found in one of these studies, they're looking at men and women. So it could be that some of these studies were only looking at men, some of them were only looking at women, and the ratios are different there. Women are strangled more often than men. And so also think about other factors that are linked. For instance, maybe women have weaker bones, and therefore the chance of fracturing is higher, and that accounts for some of the discrepancy in that statistic. is something to consider. And here's a link to one of the articles about this. Basically, this morning I was looking. I found it was saying that the autopsy is here, and there's some articles on it. I want to take a look at that. Really excited to look at that. It's really interesting. So, just once again, to sum everything up, if you look through the chances that there are these particular symptoms, you'll find that the chance that Epstein was hung is about 25%. The chance that he was strangled is around 75%, making a ton of assumptions. And that's the main thing I want to emphasize here, is that science isn't perfect. This is probably a lot better than the guy just going on Fox and Friends and saying, well, this is what I think. Because this is actually looking at scientific data rather than his personal experience as a physician. Because I went through, in his personal experience as a physician, the chance of this actually happening is like 1 in 10 to the 1 in 10 to the power of like 13, which is obviously not correct. So I wanted to actually look at the scientific studies to see for sure. But yeah, lots and lots of flaws here. So take all of this with a massive grain of salt, and take everything, whatever people say, with a massive grain of salt, because science isn't perfect. But also consider the fact that, well, this is probably the best I can get, and this is what it says. But yeah, feel free to argue in the comments. Just keep it civil. Obviously, don't call anyone idiots. But thank you very much for watching. This took a little bit of time to make, and I would highly appreciate it if this was worth your time, if this was insightful. Leave a like. If it wasn't, feel free to leave a dislike, and obviously comment feedback to me, so that way I know maybe there's a professional out there who knows a little bit more about this than me, and I'd love to hear your take on this. And, feel free to share this. If you think anyone else might find this useful, feel free to share it. I know a lot of people, at least at my university, are really big on science. They're really big on this sort of thing. So, I'm sure a lot of people like that would appreciate it. But, until my next video, which will probably be Minecraft, don't forget to contribute, and as always, make the most of your day.